and on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline to chat a little bit about the NBA. Interesting night last night. Big game tonight for the Sixers. February 7th is coming. Sean Deveney from the Sporting News joins us now to talk a little hoops on 97.3 ESPN. Sean, welcome back, pal. How you been?
I'm doing well. How are you?
We're doing all right. So Sixers and the Pacers tonight. You know, this is an interesting game. It's very interesting to talk about a specific regular season game, but we've been talking a lot about how in the East it looks like a 5-team race, and nobody wants to be in the 4 and the 5 spot. Tonight's game, you know, you start to put these games under the microscope a little bit here, and the Sixers, let's be honest, haven't been winning these games. They beat Indiana earlier, but it seems that every time they're up against somebody, they fail that challenge. So are you looking at this game specifically tonight for Philadelphia and Indiana?
Yeah, you know, I mean, Indiana has certainly been a team that has exceeded expectations. They've done it in part because they've had a pretty good, favorable schedule to open the year. Not that they haven't had to go out on the road, but they're pretty well able to beat up on the lesser teams of the East, and that's in part why their record is what it is. So they kind of need this game. I think that's something that they're looking at going forward as you know, they're constantly trying to prove themselves as one of those top 3, top 4 teams in the East. And this is the kind of game that they really need. But obviously for the Sixers, I mean, it's just been so hard to establish consistency with this team, and you're in a situation now where you're coming off that loss to the Hawks, and you get you get 2 wins in a row. You get the just the brilliant performance against the Timberwolves. You really have to carry that over. You can't just let that be the last positive, and then you go out and lose to Indiana. Especially, they've got a pretty tough road ahead of them. They've got some tough games on the homestand, and then they go out on the road. So they've got a pretty tough schedule ahead of themselves after this game. They've got to find a way to establish some consistency against the best teams in the league.
Yeah, right now, are they just not as good as some of these teams? Like, why do you feel that they keep coming up short? Is it just simply they're not as good? They don't have the depth? Brett Brown is not as, that's the Philadelphia in us, right? Brett Brown's not as good a coach. You hear that here a lot. Every time they lose to Boston or Milwaukee or Toronto, that's the reason. But is it simply put that they are not ready on that level yet? Why do they seem to come up short in those games?
It's depth. I mean, you've got to have a bench, and they know it. And you look at what they're trying to do on the trade market, and things you've heard and things we probably haven't heard at this point. They know that they're a thin team. The Markelle Fultz experiment, obviously that collapsed pretty quickly, and you have to bring JJ into the starting 5, and that wasn't really the plan because they knew they had real issues on the bench. When you're trying to compete against the other top teams, that's really where the difference is. It's the bench, and they've got to be able to go through stretches where they can rest their guys and not give up a lead, and not have the game turn against them the way it typically does. They need guys who can spread the floor. We all know that. That's something that they've really been looking for. They've done a better job internally of that, just themselves. They've shot the ball better, I think, than a lot of us would have expected. But they've got to add depth. That's really the big difference between them and the other top teams, not just in the East, but really around the league.
So, Sean Deveney from the Sporting News, they need some depth. I saw your article about a week ago about some names they could be interested in, and I was a little not surprised that they might be willing to dangle their first-round pick for some of the players. I guess it tells you what the market looks like right now. I think you mentioned like Frank Kaminsky, Mike Scott. There was another Noah Vonleh.
Yeah.
Jeremy Lin. So is that the level of player that's available, or is that the level of player that the Sixers have assets to be able to be in play for?
It's a tough time to be a buyer on the trade market right now because you look around, just look at the standings, right? You've got 25 teams that have legitimate shots at the playoffs. You're only talking about 5 teams that you can really look at and say, okay, they're out of it. They're going to be selling. They're going to be selling at the deadline. There's really not much that's going to happen, I think, between now and February 7th that's going to change that. So as long as that's the case, it's going to be tough to find useful parts that you can have. It's also going to be difficult on the buyout market as well. Two guys that the Sixers got last year, Bellinelli and Ilyasova. That's probably not going to be there this year. You can't count on that. That's for sure. Because again, you've got a lot of teams that have hopes of making the playoffs, and as long as that's the case, then I think you got to lower your expectations a little bit. Obviously they'd be willing to go in a little deeper in terms of what they'd give up in terms of the picks and things like that. But then some other teams, I think there's a lot more riding on this season for them than there is probably for some other teams. But really, that's the level of player that you're talking about in terms of what you're going to get back.
So, as it stands right now, are the Sixers still cornered where they have to make a move, kind of just to have to make a move? Or do you think that based on, despite win or loss, Sean, just what we've seen from a bench, that there's enough confidence right now that guys can grow into positions maybe short-term for this year until the offseason when they can really address it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think they're going to do anything stupid. I think in the end, they're not going to make a move to make a move. You'd like to see how some of the younger guys can develop. Of course, Landry Shamet has been really good. He's been a real find for them, and they've used him obviously quite a bit. We'll see if Jonah Bolden, adds up to anything. He's really struggled with his shot. He's a guy, though, that obviously has a lot of international, has some international experience, has maybe not been the kind of development that we've seen from other players, but he's a guy who certainly they think can be a contributor at some point. I don't know if it's going to be now, but they're going to obviously give him a chance, give him some minutes. There might be some answers already on the roster, but more likely it's something where they're going to have to make a trade if they really want to upgrade that bench.
Sean, last night Kyrie Irving, after the big Celtics win, came out and said, I had to call LeBron. I admitted I was wrong. I needed some help regarding leadership and also issued an apology. And the reason why I bring that up is because it made me think of the dynamic the Sixers have currently with the addition of Jimmy Butler. He is an alpha. He is the leader in his mind and typically on the teams he is on. And then you have Joel Embiid, who is young and up and coming and an MVP candidate, and he's still figuring out how to become that voice and that leader. So my question to you is, how do you see that Embiid-Butler dynamic playing out as the season goes along, potentially down the road? Is that a potential concern? Embiid could not develop as a leader. There could be butting heads there, or are they going to be able to work this out?
I think they'll be able to work it out. Embiid's a pretty strong character, and you look at what's happened with Butler and the places that he's been before, whether it's Minnesota. Obviously, we saw him with Karl Anthony Towns and Andrew Wiggins, and in Chicago before that. He was surrounded by much lesser players and certainly much less forceful personalities. I don't think anybody's going to accuse Joel Embiid of not having a forceful personality. So, I think that if Butler tries to do some of the things that he's done in the past, I don't think Embiid lets him get away with it. I think there is going to be a different dynamic there. I think maybe you worry a little bit more about some of the other young guys, certainly Simmons and some of the guys you mentioned before. But I think as far as the Butler and Embiid dynamic, I just think Embiid is he's been through a lot, obviously personally to get here, to get to where he is right now. I don't think he needs anybody coming in and try to point him in this direction, trying to point him in that direction. So I don't think that's going to be as much of a problem. I think maybe you might worry about other guys on the roster. I think Embiid will be able to handle himself, though.
What about the head coach when it comes to handling ego and talent? Rotations are another thing. I don't know if that's ever going to be solved here, but at least in the backdrop of what you just answered, Sean, having to deal with a guy like Jimmy Butler, which is new for Brett Brown, and also being loyal to the guys like Joel Embiid and Ben Simmons who have come up with this team. Do you think that there's any type of extra pressure on Brett Brown to get this thing done?
Oh, I don't think there's any question. And it's funny that you brought up the Kyrie thing, because I also think that, Brad Stevens is in a similar situation in Boston where, as Brett Brown is, where, if you're always the underdog, and you're always not supposed to win, and you're always playing a lesser hand, and you somehow manage to win, and everybody praises you. What do you do when you're the favorite? And that's sort of the situation that Brett Brown's in. That now that he's got a talented team, now that it's not the process team that it was when he first got the job. You can say the same for Brad Stevens in Boston. That he had these underdog. They had a team that won 50-something games with Isaiah Thomas and Jay Crowder, and Amir Johnson was a starter back then. So they've had some of those lesser teams. For a coach, it's kind of easy to do that because the chemistry just sort of happens because nobody is expecting anything of you. The chemistry falls apart when there are those expectations, and the coach has to get in that locker room and manage it. And he's got to diffuse things before they start. That's a real challenge. When you're a coach, you can be Dr. Naismith, and that's great, but you also got to be Dr. Phil a little bit. You got to manage those internal conflicts that come up. And that's a real challenge for Brett Brown with when you bring Jimmy Butler in there. And like I say, I think that's something that's similar to what is happening now with Brad Stevens at Boston.
Sean Deveney from the Sporting News covers the NBA. Based on, Sean, what you kind of laid out about it's going to be tough to navigate the trade deadline, the buyout market not going to be as prosperous, does that kind of add up? Do those two things in your mind kind of add up to the Sixers just aren't going to be in that mix this year? Because if they don't have enough depth now and the trade market and the buyout market doesn't seem like it's going to be all that great, are they going to be that team that maybe makes it to the second round and that's their ceiling?
Yeah, obviously, as we saw last year, anything can happen. But yeah, I think that's probably. I don't think that they're quite on the level of Toronto. And Milwaukee. We'll see if Milwaukee can carry. The thing about Milwaukee is I think that they're a really good defensive team. And they don't get enough credit for that. The three-pointers are what everybody notices, but their defense has been fantastic. We'll see if Milwaukee can carry that defense into the playoffs. If they can, then you'd have to have them ahead of the Sixers. And then the Celtics, we'll see if they can ever figure things out. But certainly talent-wise, you'd have to have them ahead of the Sixers. And, of course, we know what the record has been between those two teams in recent years. So, you'd still have them sort of at the bottom part of that pecking order, which means a likely second-round exit for sure.
So what would that kind of mean for this Jimmy Butler trade and where he stands? I mean, if you look at yourself and say we got knocked out in the second round again with Joel Embiid, Ben Simmons, Jimmy Butler, I mean, what is the offseason kind of message or plan? Like, if you take a look at yourself in the mirror and we're still not good enough.
Yeah, again, you've got to be able to fill out that bench. You've got to be able to identify where your weaknesses are and address them. And no question, it's the bench right now. So, if you're able to re-sign Jimmy Butler, and then I don't think that's necessarily 100%, but you've got the deal, and obviously that's going to be Plan A. But you bring him back, then you've got to find ways to fill those holes in the bench, the holes that they just really weren't able to fill heading into the season, and we'll see if they're able to do anything in the next 5 weeks here.
All right, Sean, let's take a look at last night. You got Toronto and Boston. What did we learn about that? Because Boston had been really struggling. They lost to the Nets. They lost to the Heat. They lost to the Magic. They got fist fights. They got guys, all sorts of turmoil there. And then they play the best team in the East by many people's account, and they win that game last night. So you're in your clause with Boston. Surmise what we now know or what we learned, if anything, from Boston beating Toronto.
Their biggest enemy is themselves. I don't think there's any question about that. That, like I say, I think Brad Stevens hasn't been called out on this enough. That he doesn't manage the locker room particularly well, and that's something that is obviously costing them throughout this season. He's a great X's and O's guys, but you've got to be able to deal with guys who are going to be free agents, young guys who aren't getting the minutes they think they should be getting. These are common NBA problems that he's really being hit with for the first time. So I think that A, they're their own worst enemy, but B, they can beat anybody. I mean, they're good enough to beat anybody. You've got Gordon Hayward coming in. Granted, you're paying him $30 million, but you got him coming in as your sixth man. That's a pretty good setup. And then Jaylen Brown is, your seventh man. You've got Terry Rozier as your eighth man. I mean, these are guys who would be starting on quite a few teams. So, most teams really. So, they can beat anybody. But they've got to figure out how to get out of their own way and figure out how to make the chemistry work.
Sean, how late in the season do we have to get? And I don't know if we're there yet, but how late do we have to get before we start looking at the Denver Nuggets as a reality and not just a myth?
Well, I think the game against the Warriors was a bit of a reality check for them. Obviously that didn't go as Mike Malone would have hoped. Where they let up 51 points in the first quarter the other night. The reality of the Nuggets is they played really good defense coming out of the gate. So their defensive numbers right now look pretty good. But if you break them down and look over the last 25 or 30 games, more like 20, 25 games, I should say, they've really slipped. They've gotten back to being the kind of Nuggets that we're used to, which is, a team that can score but can't defend. That's still the issue with them, and they've got to be able to bring the defense night in and night out. It's tough when Jokic is your main player, and he's slow, and they have a hard time, and teams have figured out how to get him juggled up in the pick and roll, and that's really tough. But they've got to find ways to counteract that. If they can't be at least an average defensive team, 12 to 15 in terms of their ranking defensively, then they're going to be in danger. Really, possibly even losing in the first round. I mean, they are a very nice regular season team that could have trouble making that translate into the playoffs.
Sean Deveney, sporting news here on the Sports Bash. The NBA season about halfway through. Who's the best team in the East? Halfway.
I'd probably say, like I say, Milwaukee, with the defense that they've played, I think you've got to give it to them because they have the rim protection. They've been really good out on the perimeter. Chris Middleton, I think, had a great start to the season. He has slumped, but I think he'll rebound and play well in the second half. I think in the end it's Milwaukee. They've got some depth. And I think that they're pretty well constructed. I don't know how they translate to the playoffs. That's the one thing that I'd say. But I think that just the way that they play night in and night out right now, they're probably the best team in the East.
I don't think. And is there a challenger to Golden State in the West? I know it's been close, and Denver was a nice story. But is there a real Western Conference challenger? Is it Houston? Is there anybody?
No, there really isn't. Even Oklahoma City, you can look at them, and they've played well. They've had some great stretches, but they played a really easy schedule, and that's going to catch up with them. Maybe Utah, and Utah is starting to make its move. We've seen this time and time again with them, where they start slow, and then they really they had a tough schedule to open the year. So Utah might be, if I had to pick a dark horse, as far as a team that could challenge the Warriors, I keep an eye on Utah, but really, that's a stretch.
All right, Sean Deveney, the NBA trade deadline coming up February 7th. Sixers, one of the very few teams it seems like willing to dangle their first-round pick. Now, remember, that's going to be a pick probably in the 20s, so we'll see. Not that Heat pick yet. Doesn't seem like they're ready to budge.
And Mike, just to be clear, they will not dangle that Heat pick. They are not doing anything with that. They are keeping that, and they should, because the Heat probably will be terrible when that pick comes up.
All right, Sean, we'll appreciate it, man. We'll catch up with you soon.
All right, Mike, thanks.